Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the endgame series with probably the most important endgame of all, and that's king and one pawn versus king. Don't be confused by this image here, I just wanted to illustrate something about the critical squares, and I'm going to get to that. King and one pawn versus king is the quintessential endgame because every single endgame could reach that point, and that's sort of the final point of the game before it's a definite draw, before the two kings play against each other and there's no more material. King and one pawn versus king is generally you cannot checkmate, so you have to promote your pawn to a queen, and that's going to be done by using critical squares, as you can see in this image. The second principle I'm going to go over is the rule of the square. If you have seen the video on the opposition, I have already talked about that, but I'm going to repeat it here because it's very important. So, queening a pawn is the essential thing in a king and pawn versus king ending, and you can do that easily, and you can learn that easily by remembering the rule of the critical squares. Critical squares are the squares in front of your pawn, which when your king reaches, you can be certain that your pawn is going to queen. So in this case, for the e4 pawn, the critical squares are the squares d5, e5, and f5. So when the pawn is not on the rook files, so it's not on the A file or on the H file, and it hasn't reached the 6th rank, its critical squares are the 3 squares in front of it on its own file and on the 2 adjacent files, so 2 squares ahead. So for an E4 pawn, the critical squares will be D5, E5, and F5. For, let's say, the C2 pawn, the critical squares would be B4, C4, and D4. The situation changes and the number of the critical squares increases when the pawn reaches the 6th rank, and as you can see with the example of the g6 pawn, the critical squares of the g6 pawn are f7, g7, h7, h8, g8, and f8. So if the white king manages to reach any of these squares, the pawn is going to queen, and there is nothing the black king can do about it. So for example, if the pawn was on d6, its critical squares would be c7, c8, d7, d8, e7, e8. So this is the one most important principle that if you remember, you are going to be able to adjust your plans according to that principle, and you're not going to be calculating 20 moves ahead of whether you can win by opposition or whatever. You can simply tell that if your king can reach one of these squares, it's going to be winning. The situation is different for rook file pawns, so for the A pawn and for the H pawn. Once the pawn doesn't reach the 6th rank, unless it reaches the 6th rank, so let's say the pawn is on a2, it has only one critical square, two squares in front of it. So for an a2 pawn, the critical square would be the b4 square. And once the pawn reaches the 6th rank, then it has two critical squares, same as any other pawn on the 6th rank, but it only has two critical squares on the file adjacent to it. So for the a6 pawn, the two critical squares are b7 and b8, and for an, let's say, h6 pawn, the two critical squares would be g7 and g8. And this is the one principle that you have to remember. The second thing that you have to keep in mind for king and pawn versus king endings is the rule of the square, which states that if your opponent's king is inside of the square of the pawn that you are trying to queen, so let's say there are no a pawn and g pawn on the board, so you want to queen your e pawn. If the black king is inside of the square, imaginary square which you make by making a square around your pawn, so in this case it has to be a perfect square. So a square which is determined with the positioning of your pawn and the queening square, and you copy that to the other side, make a square. So if the black king is inside of the square, the pawn cannot queen and the black king can catch it. If the king is not inside of the square, that means that white is going to queen the pawn. And here we are not taking into consideration the opposition or anything else. This is just a general rule. Imagine the white king being on a1. In fact, I'm going to set up a position like that just to show it to you. Clear board. Let's put the white king on a stupid square. Let's put the pawn here and the black king here. Analysis board. So okay, in this case, since you have the pawn on e4, its square is e8, e4, e4, a4, and a4, a8. So this is the square. If the black king is inside of the square, regardless of who is to play, the pawn can be caught. So whoever is to play, let's say white plays, the black king is going to be able to catch the pawn. he is inside of the square. Had the king been outside of the square, let's draw the square once again. If the black king was here, then if it's black to move and if black can enter the square, he can catch the pawn. If it's white to move and the king is on b3, for example, outside of the square, then the white pawn is just going to queen. Let's say king from b3 to c4, pawn moves king from c4 to d5, pawn moves, and you can see that the king is unable to catch the pawn. So these are the principles that you have to keep in mind when we go into the positions we are about to see. Today we are going to look at 7 different positions, which if you remember the principles in all of them, if you keep them in your head, then it's going to be easy to understand any single king and pawn versus king ending. Once again, the 2 basic principles of the critical squares and of the rule of the square have to be kept in mind, and then you have to remember the principles that we are going to see in the next 7 positions. Okay, we are going to start with the pawn on the 6th rank. The positions with the pawn on the 6th rank are the most basic positions, and every other position that we build on this is going to be influenced by this position that you see here. So when the pawn has reached the 6th rank, we already know that its critical squares are, in this example, e7, e8, f7, f8, and g7 and g8. So that means that if the white king is able to reach any single one of these squares is going to be a win for white. On the other hand, if the black king can manage to control all of them, and if the white king isn't able to reach them, then it's going to be a draw. And this is the most thematic position, and whichever other position you put down on the board with the pawn on the 6th rank, unless it's on the h file or on the a file, is going to be simpler than this, because you're going to be able to calculate it. Either the black king is going to be too far away, or the black king is going to be too close and catch the pawns. This is the critical position. And now, this is a position which features mutual Zugzwang, which means that whoever is to play either has an advantage or a disadvantage. In this case, we are going to see what happens. So you have to be able to assess the position and see who is going to be better depending on whose move it is. In this exact position, which is the critical position, we are going to look at it from both sides, white to play and black to play. If you want, you can pause the video for each exercise, and I'm going to just say the solutions. If you want, pause the video and try to solve it for yourself. So white to play, who is better? Is white winning or is it a draw? Black to play, is white winning or is it a draw? Okay, in this exact position, if the pawn is on the 6th rank, opposition solves the whole problem. So whoever has the opposition is going to win. In this case, if white is to play, then he has a reserve move. He can put his pawn to f7, and black is going to be forced to move. So if it's white to play, and white plays f7, then black simply loses the game. If you see the squares that the black king can go to, he only has one square, and that's the g7 square. After king g7, white is simply going to play king e7, and whatever black does, the pawn is going to queen. Therefore, white wins. If it's black to play on the other hand, and you know what the opposition is, if you haven't seen the video, once again, I will link it in the description below. Look at it before you continue. If it's black to play, the king is able to gain opposition, therefore he is able to draw the game. In this case, since the white king is on e6, black can gain the opposition by coming to the same file where the white king is, and them having an odd number of squares between them. That means that if the black king plays the move e8, so king e8, there is an odd number of squares between the kings, and it's white to move, therefore black has the opposition. White has the compulsion to move. And this position is now a draw. Whatever white does, this position is a draw, and it's going to end with the move f7, as we are going to see. After f7, the king is simply going to play king f8, and whatever white does, he is either going to lose the pawn by moving the king away from the defense of the pawn, or he is going to play the move king f6, and the position is a draw. The black king is in stalemate, it has no available squares. Let's say white tries to be smart, and after king e8, black gaining the opposition, white tries to lure the king away or gain the opposition or something. The black king can always draw the game. Let's say king f5. What can black do here? He plays king f8. After king f8, and let's say king e5, where white is preparing to gain the opposition himself, the black king can be resilient and simply continue with the move king f7. The one thing you need to remember with these positions, after king e8 and let's say king f5, your goal with the black king is to come to the same file and just repeat the moves. Play king f7, king f8, king f7, king f8, and repeat. You want to be able to repeat those two moves to make sure you can gain the opposition when necessary. So after king e5, king f7, king f5, king f8. And let's say white tries to enter your position, either via g6 or e6. If king g6, you gain the opposition, odd number of squares on the same file with white to move. King g8, you have the opposition. The white king cannot do anything. Okay, after king f5, let's say white tries again, king f7. After king e5, king f8. Let's say white tries king e6 now. You play king e8. After king e8, f7 is going to be played eventually, and then king f8, king f6, and it's a draw. In this position after king e6, king e8, of course, this position with f7 is crucial. So in this position, if it's white to play, if he gets to play the move f7 when the king is on f8, then the king has no other squares, he needs to get away, the white king advances and wins. If it's black to play, he simply plays king e8, keeping the opposition and drawing the game. This is the simplest king and pawn versus king ending, and this one you simply have to memorize in order to be able to advance forward to the other exercises. Okay, the next position we are going to be looking at is a pawn on the 6th rank with the pawn being on the rook file, so either on the A file or on the H file. And there is only one simple rule that you have to remember here. Whoever it is to play, it's a draw if black can control the queening square, the promotion square. So in this case, if black can control the A8 square, then it's a draw, whoever is to play. So let's say it's white to play. He pushes the pawn forward, which is the most logical move. If the king goes to A8, then you can see that if the white king defends the pawn with A6, then it's stalemate. The black king has no squares. If white tries to play something else, let's say he moves around, he doesn't want to play A7, then the position is still a draw. Black simply repeats the moves in a triangle here, king B8, king A8, king A7. And if it's black to move in this position, he does the same thing. In this position, he simply plays king A8, king B8, king A8, king B8. So this is fairly simple, but it's important to keep it in mind because you have to be aware of what the ending is like. You have to be, let's say there is one more pawn here, a black pawn here, pawn here, and a couple of rooks on the board. If you see a position where you can change off all the pawns and both rooks and have this position with white, then if you know that it's a draw, you're not going to trade everything off. Conversely, if you know that white is a pawn up and you are playing this position with the black pieces, with let's say some rooks on the board, and you can trade off the rooks, then you will be aware that this position is drawn and you may go for it. Any more complicated positions can be applied to this principle. So if the pawn is on a3, regardless of where the kings are, the only thing, if you know this rule, the only thing you have to calculate is whether your opponent's king can reach the queening square. If the pawn is on h4, advancing forward. If the black king can reach h8 before the white king, it's a draw. If it cannot, then it's a win for white. This principle is important, keep it in mind. And when we advance with the endgame series, there are going to be positions with king and pawn versus king and pawn, king and two pawns versus king and two pawns, which are going to get much more complex. And these principles, especially this one and the last one, are going to be used in almost every one of them. The next exercise, the next position, is going to be king in front of the pawn on the 6th rank. So there will be a difference between a king in front of a pawn. Let's say if a pawn is on f2 and the king is on f3, there will be a difference from the king being on the 6th rank and not being on the 6th rank, and we are going to see what that is. So in this position, the white king is in front of the pawn and it has reached the 6th rank. One thing that you have to remember about this position is that it's always winning. Why is it always winning? Because white has one extra move to gain the opposition regardless of what black does. So whichever side you decide to go to, let's say king c6 or king e6, if the black king tries to keep the opposition, let's say king c6, the black king thinks he has the opposition king c8, now you can play your extra tempo move d6 and all of a sudden you have the opposition. And now regardless of what black does, let's say his most resilient move is king to d8. If he doesn't play king d8, then it's winning immediately. After king d8, you can simply continue with d7, and once again, the black king has no squares, it has to exit the position, and you simply queen. Okay, so remember that when your king is in front of your pawn on the 6th rank, regardless of where the black king is, the position is always winning. This is also a principle when you apply it to more complex endings with more pawns or even some pieces. If you know this, you're going to be able to have a better general understanding of the position and what sort of endgame you want to play. The next position is sort of the advanced variation of what we just saw. So the king in front of the pawn on the 6th rank. The difference is that with the pawns on the knight files, you need to be sort of careful and you need to be precise. It's still always winning for white, but some technique is required. So in this position, you can go, like in the previous one that we saw, you can either go king f6 or king h6. And whichever way you go, you are going to win, but it's much simpler to win if you go towards the edge of the board. Just to mention, if it's black to play, whatever black does, it's completely winning for white. King h8, king f7, and it's just winning. The king has to go to h7 and you win. If king f8, you play king h7 and it's winning even more easily. So if it's black to play, it's clear enough. If it's white to play, the imprecise way to play would be towards the center of the board. So let's say you play king f6. Then white has the defense king h7, and now you continue with king f7. If you continue after king h7, if you continue with g6, king f7, king h7. If you continue with the move g6, now the position is a complete draw. So you can see, that's why I turned on the engine. After king f6, king h7, if you continue with g6 check, it's now a draw and there's no way you can win. That is why going towards the center is risky. Still, if you do know how to play it, king f6, king h7, you have to play king f7 to control the queening squares. You can still win, but it's much more complicated and you can stalemate your opponent. So you can continue from here, let's say king h8, and you need to be precise, you need to keep being precise, and you need to get towards this position and come back and play the move king h6 eventually. So remember that rule. If you have this position in which you have your king in front of the pawn on the 6th rank, so your king is on the 6th rank, you need to go towards the edge of the board. That's the way to win. So king h6. After king h6, there are no more stalemate tricks, and the king cannot hide in the corner. After you move toward the edge of the board, your opponent's king cannot hide there. So the most logical move for black, of course, if he doesn't want to resign his position immediately, if the king moves to the f-file, then you simply play king h7, and your next 3 moves are going to be g6, g7, g8. So the most resilient move is king h8, after which you now continue with g6, and after king g8, you play the move g7 and we get the same position that we saw before when the pawn was on the 6th rank, but not on the knight file. The king moves out to f7, king h7, your next move is going to be queening. So remember that when you have your king on the 6th rank and you have your pawn on the knight files, you have to go towards the edge of the board and not towards the center. If you go towards the center, you might mess it up and you are definitely going to have to reach the same position again to be able to move towards the edge of the board. Okay. Okay, the next exercise, the next position is probably what you see in most puzzles books and endgame books, and as the simple one which you solve at the start. And this position is absolutely quintessential. This one you have to know, and this is going to be the most useful endgame knowledge which you are ever going to get. And once you understand it, you can then apply it to endless different endgames that you are going to play in your career. Okay. So this position is very important. Once the king is not on the 6th rank, so on the 5th rank or below the 5th rank, which means that the pawn is on the 4th rank or below, that means that the pawn no longer has 6 critical squares, as when it's on the 6th rank. When it's on the 5th rank, it of course has 3 critical squares on the 7th rank, and when it's on the 4th rank, it has 3 critical squares on the 6th rank. So if the white king manages to control one of these 3 squares, it means that the position is going to be winning for white. Therefore, the outcome of the game is going to be determined by whose turn it is. It's going to be determined with opposition. If you can pause the video now and try to figure out what's the position like with white to play and what's the position like with black to play, that could be a useful exercise. Okay, with white to play, with one square between the kings on the same file and with white to play, that means that black has the opposition. And if you remember the position that we saw with the pawn on the 6th rank, there's really no difference to it here. If black has the opposition, he is able to draw. How is he able to? If white has to move and black has the opposition, whatever white does, he can go to e5 or to c5. Let's say he goes to c5. The black king simply follows him. So king c7, king d5, the king goes back. King e5, the king goes here. And eventually, the white king is going to have to give up moving along the 5th rank. He's going to have to try something different. So let's say he goes to c4, trying to provoke the black king. King c6, keeping the opposition. The white king has to move. And white seemingly has a tempo move here, but the black king can repeat the same trick that we saw when the pawn was a bit closer up the board. So let's say d5 check. And now the black king is simply going to repeat the same thing. King d7, king d6, king d6, king d7, king d7, king d6, until the white king tries to enter the position, and then the black king is going to take the opposition and force the white king to move again. So let's say king d4, you repeat king d6, king e4, you repeat king d7, and let's say the white king tries to enter now. Let's say he tries king e5, you simply play the move king to e7, and if you turn on the engine, it's a complete draw, dead draw, and it's going to end up in the same position that we just saw. It's going to be the same thing. You repeat this position we had. So let's say you repeat here king d7, king d8. As soon as the white king tries to enter, you stop it. Okay, so that's the position with the white king below the 6th rank or the 5th rank or below the 5th rank. With white to move. So with white to move, black having the opposition, it's a draw. With black to move, it's a whole different story. Of course, if it's black to move, white is easily winning. Whichever way the black king goes, white is going to gain control of one of the critical squares. If we know that the critical squares here are c6, d6, and d6, then we know that if the king goes to e7, you're going to gain control of the critical square c6. If the king goes to c7, the white king is going to gain control of the critical square e6. So let's say king e7. This position is now completely winning. Whatever the black king does, king d8 doesn't matter. White has enough pawn moves and it can force the black king wherever he wants. King d6, king d8, and now you get the position we saw already. The king has to get out. You get here, the king moves, you queen. So this is the simplest thing to understand. This we already saw, and you can already see that we are building on the knowledge from the exercises we were looking at previously. One exception which has to be said is that if the king is below the 6th rank, on the 5th rank, or below the 5th rank, and you get the same position as here, we had the exact same king position, okay, we have it here, but the pawn hasn't advanced yet, so the pawn is either on the 2nd or the 3rd rank, then white has a tempo move in reserve. That means that white is winning no matter what, because white can gain the opposition by moving his pawns. So in this position that we saw, when it was white to move and black had the opposition he was drawing, so we played king c5 and black kept the opposition, white can now easily gain the opposition. If we saw this position where if it's black to move, white is winning, so we played king e7 and the king went here. If we want to provoke the same thing here, then you simply move the pawn. What do you do by moving the pawn? You make black move. You give black the compulsion to move. You put black in Zugzwang and you gain the opposition. If it's black to move, this is the position that we already saw. The king is going to go somewhere. You're going to gain control of one of the critical squares and the position is going to be easily winning. Whatever black does, the position is easily winning. Okay, so this is what you have to remember about the king being below the 6th rank. Things get a bit different, things get a bit complicated, but remember that whenever you have a pawn that hasn't advanced yet, don't move it up for no reason. Your goal is to get as best king position as you can, to make sure you have the opposition, or if you don't have the opposition, keep a pawn move in reserve, like here, White has a pawn move in reserve here. As soon as he wants, he can play the move d4, gain the opposition, and win the game. Okay, the next exercise is going to be using the principle of distant opposition to achieve the same kind of positions that we were looking at before. Okay, so in this example, it is white or black to play. We are going to look at it for both sides. But you can see that if black is able to get into the position to control the critical squares, so for example, for the f2 pawn, it will be the square e4, f4, and g4, and in this case, for the e2 pawn, it will be d4, e4, and f4. If black is able to control one of those squares, then he is going to draw immediately. So if it's black to play and he is able to control one of those squares, let's say he plays king f5, and white plays king e2, trying to get in front of the pawn. I'm sorry about this, there seems to be some problems with my connection. King f5, king e2. Once white plays king e2, black can play the move king f4, and after king f4, regardless of what white does, black has the same positions we had before on the previous ranks. So let's say f3, chasing the king away, king f5. And now you're going to be repeating the same thing. First you're going to repeat king f4, king f5, then you're going to be repeating king f6, king f5, then you're going to be repeating king f7, king f6, and then finally you're going to be repeating king f8, king f7, until you reach the position that we already had and you're going to draw. So king e3, king e5. Take the opposition. Whenever the white king tries to enter the position, you play these two moves and repeat to be able to meet him. So as soon as the white king tries to advance, king e3, you meet him with opposition, king e5. Then f4, he forces you back, king f5. Now you repeat between f6 and f5. So king f3, king f6. The white king tries to enter, king e4, meet him with opposition, king e6. Then he advances, f5, king f6. Now you repeat between king f7 and king f6. King f4, you repeat, king f7. King e5, he tries to advance, you meet him, and so on until you reach the final position that we already had on the board twice, in which it's a stalemate and you draw. The position is different though if it's white to move, and if it's white to move, you can mess the position up unless you are aware of the principle of the distant opposition. So normal opposition is when there is one square, or full opposition is when there is one square between the two kings. So only one square, an odd number of squares, one square between the two kings, that's full opposition. The thing that you need to be able to apply here is remember the principle of the distant opposition and how to enter the full opposition from it. Because you cannot draw the game from the distant opposition, you can draw the game from full opposition, but you want to use the distant opposition to get to full opposition. For some reason my board moved involuntarily. Okay, so let's see. If it's black to move, we saw that black is able to control one of these three squares and draw in the way which we already saw several times. If it's white to move, however, it's quite different. After knight to d2, you now want to get the distant opposition. The distant opposition is same as full opposition, but you don't have one square in between the kings, you have three squares. So the full opposition here would be, ideally, you can get your king to d4. If you can get your king to d4, it's certainly a draw. But in this case, since you are unable to play king d4, you take distant opposition, you play king d6. And now there is three squares in between the kings. This is distant opposition, and you are sure that you are going to be able to draw. Wherever the white king advances, if it goes to c3, you can meet him. If it goes to d3, you can meet him. If it goes to e3, you can meet him. The only thing is that there are some better moves. Let's say if it goes to c3, you can definitely then go to e5. But the best move for white is king e3. Him trying to get in front of his pawn, push the pawn forward. And now you play the move king e5, simply meeting him in full opposition. And this is the position that we just looked at, and it's a complete draw. So once again, if the kings are too far apart, the easiest way to draw is to remember distant opposition. So king d2, king d6, distant opposition. After king d6, king e3, meet the king in full opposition, and it's still a draw. So remember that's for these positions where there is a lot of space between your pawn and its queening squares. If your opponent's king can meet you in distant opposition, that means that he can get full opposition and draw. The final position that we are going to be looking at today, and the final principle that you should remember to be able to play king and pawn endings and then build up to king and pawn versus king and pawn endings and king and two pawns and stuff like that, is the principle of the rook pawn. And one principle which you have to remember is that the only way white can win this position, if you remember the critical squares that we were looking at before, let's say your pawn is on a6, that means that the pawn's critical squares are going to be b7 and b8. That's what we talked about. If your pawn is on a3, then the critical square is going to be b5. In this case, for the moment, the h4 pawn has the critical square g6, and once it reaches g6, the critical squares are going to be g7. Once it reaches h6, the critical squares are going to be g7 and g8. That means that if white is able to control one of these two squares, he is going to win because the pawn is going to inevitably move forward. And that also means that if the black king is able to control these two squares, the black king can draw and black draws the game. That means that the general rule for h and the a pawns, the rook file pawns, is that if you are defending, if you can defend by controlling the g7 or the g8 square, or if the pawn is on the a file, the b7 and the b8 square, the game is the draw. This is the only thing that you have to remember. So in this case, if it's white to move, white is simply going to, if it's white to move, it's a draw still. I thought that, for example, king g7 would draw, but after king g7, black can simply play the move king g4 and still draw the game. The critical way to see this position is king f6, and after the king reaches f6, there is no way for white to make progress. If he plays king h7, then the black king simply follows them, and you are not allowing the white king to exit the position. That's basically it. If he manages to exit the position via h6, h5, g4, and the black king reaches the corner, so let's say the square h8 and g8, then it's still going to be a draw. So in this position, let's say h5, gaining a tempo, but it doesn't mean anything. King f8, king h6, king g8, and now the king has reached the corner. White can no longer do anything. Once the king gets to the corner, there is no way to win this position. If I turn on the engine, it's going to be all zeros and it's going to be a dead draw. There's basically nothing white can do. The second attempt after king f6 could be h5 immediately, but still there's no help there. King f7, king g5, king g7, h6 check, king h8. Once the king reaches the corner, it's a dead draw and you cannot do anything. So these are the principles I wanted to talk about. The first thing you should do is practice all of this by yourself. Put up random positions on the board, put them on leeches or wherever, and play against the engine just to test the principles. All of them have to be reinforced in your mind. But one thing is certain, then, that once you play them out a couple of times, once you understand them, you're going to get much better at the end game, and you're going to be able to apply those same principles to much higher level endings, much more complicated end games with more pieces, more pawns, and which are generally more complicated. As always, I'm going to be offering some more content, in-depth content, and some exercises for the patrons. If you'd like to receive it, check out the link in the description below. I hope you liked the video. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. I hope you will manage to solve them all, get them all, and improve on them. And yeah, thanks once again. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.